Hi, everyone. Welcome to Women in Literature. My name is Holly Blackford. You are absolutely welcome to refer to me as Holly. I don't need you to say Professor Blackford unless it makes you feel comfortable. And my last name's actually going to be changing this semester because I'm getting married. I'll let you know when that happens. But Holly is fine for now. I hope you were enjoying Harriet Jacobs' slave narrative. It is one of my absolute favorite pieces to teach. It's incredibly teachable and interesting. Let me tell you a little bit about why I find it so interesting. It serves as a kind of representation of a woman's perspective on the slave narrative, as opposed to the conventionally male perspective. Frederick Douglass is taken as the sort of male paradigm of the slave narrative. His first publication, The Narrative of the Life of Frederick Douglass, which was done for abolitionist purposes, is very straightforward. It's a very straightforward account of a kind of self-made man who rises from slavery to manhood through a kind of hero's journey. Actually, he republished that narrative a couple more times in his lifetime and complexified it a little bit. So what you see in that 1845 version is a very straightforward account of the self-made man conforming the slave's experience to the narrative of the American man, right? And one of the ways he does that, I don't know if you've read it, but just so you know, one of the ways he does that is by privileging the role of literacy in his life. He learns to read. He learns from a child's alphabet book. He takes it and learns to read and write. He writes in the margins of that book, and it's very much a symbol of how he's writing himself into the dominant narrative of manhood required for citizenship in American culture. The woman slave narrative is a little bit different. Things are a little bit more convoluted in the female experience. So what you see here is a much more circular kind of escape, an escape that is amazingly in plain sight, a kind of trickster forum where she is hiding in a garret that could be visible from where he is. And she literally, while she is hiding in this garret for 7 years, Linda Brent can see her master going by. You haven't gotten there yet, but eventually she's going to even write him letters from New York and watch him try to go to New York and catch her. So you have a really interesting sort of pitting of wit and cunning here, which applies to an oppressed person who's less able to just kind of make her way as done in Frederick Douglass's manhood narrative, right? She's more vulnerable. She is doubly oppressed for multiple reasons. Remember, she's only 15 when these persecutions start. So there's a lot of levels on which this kind of contrasts the more straightforward narrative of manhood that Douglass represents. She's very much doing something with womanhood, and womanhood had certain meanings in the 19th century. What you'll notice here is that she hasn't written an account in first person as herself, even though the title is written as herself. It's a little confusing. She's writing almost a novel. She puts herself in as a character named Linda Brent, and she casts her roles with everybody involved, and they're all based on real life circumstances, but it's very much cast in the terms of an almost novel or an almost seduction novel, with kind of machinations of the slave master as he tries to seduce her. There's a lot of really perverse relationships and tangled skeins of genealogy represented in the town. So it's a lot different than your usual slave narrative. One of the reasons that she cast her story in terms of a novel, almost a kind of romantic seduction novel, which jars against the slave experience, and one of the reasons that she does that is because she's pitching her story to white women in the North. She wants white women in the North to get involved in the abolition movement, particularly urgently after the passing of the Fugitive Slave Law, where the North is no longer a safe haven, but the South has required Northerners to help return slaves who've escaped. So she's writing in that context. Her story looked so sensational at the time that it was not believed partly because there were many slave narratives that were published that were not true. And the slave narrative in general has conditions around it that in the 1850s would position it as suspect if it was too sensational, if it was too erudite. People would think that's not really written by a slave. It was probably somebody who's just writing a document for the abolitionist cause, right? There's a lot of circumspect conditions that the slave narrative had to satisfy, and it was difficult for her. In fact, not until Jean Yellen, a scholar in the 1980s, tracked down Harriet Jacobs as a real person, was this authenticated as a real narrative written by an actual slave. The edition that I have is the one that Jean Yellen put out, but it's out of print. And some of you are using the online version, so that's fine. I didn't want you to spend a lot of money. But you should know that this was disbelieved for a very long time because it's such an incredible story. And that has to do with the politics of Black women's voices as well. You'll notice if you have an edition that has the editor's introduction, you'll notice there's a lot of supporting documents that slaves had to have to authenticate their story. So there's material by white women endorsing her story, including the person she worked for in the North. And the editor was Lydia Mariah Child, who was a white abolitionist, and she had quite a hand in rearranging some of the things in this story. She wanted it to be more for women. So, for example, she rearranged material in the end to be more a reflection on Linda's grandmother than on her freedom. And there's a lot of rearrangement of other material, like the chapter on neighboring sketches about violence to slaves in neighborhoods and at neighboring plantations. Child put all of those in one chapter, which sits there kind of awkwardly and kind of interrupts the story. But she kept wanting Jacobs to kind of participate more in what white women would expect in a sort of in a genre of interest, as well as in authenticity and all of those conditions that surround what the slave woman can and cannot say. So that's an area of research that you might enjoy if you're going to work on this further. But what I really like, knowing those conditions, is watching the voice of Jacobs kind of vacillate from being sort of apologetic to her audience. Oh, I'm so sorry, I lost my virtue. Oh, please don't judge the slave woman by the standards that you have. She's been, given crap from the day she was born. It's totally different. Don't judge her loss of virtue by your standards. And has a lot of sort of apostrophe. Oh, ye virtuous white women, don't be so hard on me. I didn't mean to. I was seduced. But then the voice of Jacobs, or I think of it as the voice of the feisty Jacobs, comes through a lot when she says things like, actually, I knew what I did and I did it with deliberate calculation. Okay, and that's right against the next paragraph goes off into some kind of, oh, I'm so sorry, white readers, don't judge me. I'm just a slave. I didn't know better. And then she'll say things like, it was something to triumph over Mr. Flint in a small way, even if it was using my body against him. And it was fine to give my body where there was consent, but not to my slave master, right? So there's all these kind of wonderful subterfuge ways that she's communicating her own feisty stance, but doing it in a way that she hopes white women will accept and forgive and not judge her for, because she doesn't want to be considered less of a woman. And the standards in the 19th century for being a woman and a mother were not sleeping around. That was definitely not okay. If you want to know more about sort of the construction of womanhood in the 19th century and how the Black autobiography emerged, look at Hazel Carby's book. It's called Reconstructing Womanhood. I'm actually reviewing it right now for another paper I'm writing on Hurston. It's an excellent account of how Black female identity was kind of composed or constructed as the underside of white female identity in the South. So everything white women were seen as not desirable were sort of pushed onto Black women, sexuality, maternity, resiliency, instead of the fragility of the white mistress. So all of those kind of came into a construction from a binary opposition that, then emerges in the Black writing as sort of something to be both desired and also something that should be dismantled because it's such a problematic. Jacobs is continually kind of dealing with that, dismantling dominant ideologies while also explaining them. And so she has to engage with them throughout. So that's what I love about this. I love that it's kind of a trickster narrative, that it's about the voice of the outraged mother. Women have a particularly interesting role in this slave narrative, especially Mrs. Flint. She's a piece of work. So I hope you enjoy all these elements and what an interesting sort of text it is. My main purpose today, and I don't mean to lecture you too long. I know that I'm trying to simulate some of the spontaneity that we would have in an in-person class if I could actually just talk to you, which I can't. And I did try Zoom last spring, but it didn't really work that well. The students were very shy on Zoom, and I had sort of very low participation, and it was mostly me talking anyway. So I kind of felt like this time I would do an asynchronous course, but you are welcome to engage with me anytime you want to have a meeting through WebEx or Zoom. I encourage you to let me know. We can do small groups if there's people who are not satisfied with the discussion board and the writings and they want to have more of a conversation with me, particularly as you start to cultivate projects. I am completely happy to meet with you. I miss campus. I miss all of you. It's terrible. But one thing I do want to do with you today is to bring up a passage and sort of model for you how close reading works, how you should sort of approach passages and look at the complexities in them. This is kind of the method of close reading that we promote. And it also will give you some ideas for thinking about Jacobs and thinking about what you want to post for your first response to the discussion board, wherein I'm asking you to look at the passage that I'm going to talk about and create your own ideas about it. So I'm going to pull up the passage. I can share my screen. I'm not incredibly good at all this yet, so bear with me. I'm sharing my screen, and then I can pull up the passage that I have in Word. So this is from Harriet Jacobs. This is a demonstration of close reading. The passage that I'm asking you to examine is the sale of Aunt Marthy. I'm going to read it, and then I'm just kind of gloss what I want to here and there as if you were looking at me in class. If we were in class, I would be pausing every once in a while and asking for you to give your point of view on these major questions in the passage, but we can't do that. So I'm just going to try and pretend you're my studio audience. I never signed up to be a YouTuber, by the way. But just pretend that you're there and engaging with the questions that I bring up, and this will help prepare you for the post. So this is when Dr. Flint, our stellar weird hero of this pseudo novel, who is totally lying in terms of his role, he's a real coward, really. He's being exposed by trying to sell Aunt Marthy, whom everyone knew was supposed to be a free citizen. On the appointed day, the custom advertisement was posted up proclaiming that there would be a public sale of Negroes, horses, and etc. And of course, she lists these, to make the point that these are commodities, Negroes, then horses, and etc. Right? So a commodification is trying to take effect here by Dr. Flint. Dr. Flint called to tell my grandmother that he was unwilling to wound her feelings by putting her up at auction, and that he would prefer to dispose of her at private sale. Notice the word dispose. She is disposable, and yet he doesn't want to wound her feelings, right? That's double speak. He's treating her as an emotional entity and a commodity at the same time. My grandmother saw through his hypocrisy. She understood very well that he was ashamed of the job. She was a very spirited woman, and if he was base enough to sell her when her mistress intended she should be free, she was determined the public should know it. She had for a long time supplied many families with crackers and preserves. Consequently, Aunt Marthy, as she was called, was generally known, and everybody who knew her respected her intelligence and good character. Her long and faithful service in the family was also well known, and the intention of her mistress to leave her free. Let me just pause right there. So if we were in class, I would ask you to look at the power dynamics going on here. When you have legal authority, the slave system, but then you have other types of authority that could be something to make the legal system crumble. You have public opinion. You have a community of surveillance that she's using. So you could say that as a woman, she's using relationships, local community relationships, reputation, character, knowledge of her identity as a kind of weapon against what's legal and not legal, right? So if Dr. Flint sort of represents the patriarchal slave system, she has other weapons at her hands to sort of up him, right? She can up him by using community, relationships, female sisterhoods, if you will, and I would argue food. She's kind of situated herself in the community through these crackers and preserves. I have an essay that I published on Aunt Martha and the way food works in the narrative from like 20 years ago. It always fascinated me that she writes herself into her community through a role of representing abundance in food, which would have been her role anyway as a slave. And she uses that to create a kind of entrepreneurship for her, where she's central to the community. Everybody respects, they love her food. She's often sort of at the gate feeding Linda and Benjamin as they go by, almost like a kind of goddess figure. I think of her as a kind of goddess. It talks about her midnight bakings, right? So her authority stems from things that are not legal authorities, but they are very much authorities to reckon with throughout the narrative. And that's really interesting and a site of sort of female power, if you will. So what you see here is that she's using communal weapons against him. Let me keep going. Her long and faithful service in the family was well known, and the intention of her mistress to leave free. Notice it's the intention of the mistress. Whatever the mistress wants isn't actually law, right? Again, it's that sort of female power that lurks in the cracks and crevices of law. Let's look at what she does in the sale. When the day of sale came, she took her place among the chattels, and at the call, she sprang upon the auction block. Notice the word sprang, the word spirited, right? These are feisty characteristics that I would argue Linda takes on in her machinations against her master as she struggles for some independence and integrity and authority, and rebirthing herself as a mother, where she will be kind of the outraged mother figure, and it gives her a certain urgency, a certain intimacy, a certain bind. Also, she calls her children ties to life, right? She doesn't want chains on her children, but it becomes a way in which she empowers herself to act and do something. Aunt Martha acts in a very maternal kind of way. But what I will bring up is Aunt Martha always an empowering figure for Linda? I think she's a very complex figure and very paradoxical, and many older Black women in these tales are paradoxical. They present a kind of fierce independence and autonomy and spirited feistiness, but they often sort of say, oh, let's just wait on God and see what God wants us to do. Or, oh, please don't risk yourself. Please stay in the South. I'll never see you again. Please, if we just go to the family and explain and work it out, right? So she represents a kind of complicity with the slave system in her words to Linda, but doesn't seem to embody that in her own challenges to Flint, right? So it's part of the way we'll see many young female characters kind of poised between mixed messages amongst the elders who have sort of mentorship of them. So pay attention to that and her complexity as a figure. Voices called out here, shame, shame. Who is going to sell you, Aunt Martha? Don't stand there. There's no place for you. I would point out that that line has to do with exceptionalism, which is always a problem in the slave narrative, is why did this slave escape? There's also survivor guilt, right? There's this way in which escaped slaves are both inside and outside their communities. And there's a certain power that comes from that and a certain suspicion. Other slaves may not accept them. They sort of have an exceptionalism about them. Here in this, throughout this text, it's really in terms of class. Linda is going to constantly talk about how high class her family is, especially because they can read, and especially because she even gets letters. Like later you'll see in the Nat Uprising chapter, which child, by the way, asked her to add. It wasn't in her story. She had to add it to satisfy her audience. But there you have a display of class, right? Basically, poor white mobs are given weapons to do things to Black households. And she immediately responds with putting out white quilts, and they're good preserves. And they even find her letters, and they say, she's got letters, meaning she can read and she's like better than us. And they say, who sends you letters? And she says, white people, right? Just casually, she's trying to point out that her connections with white people and her status gives her a certain immunity and privilege over those poor whites. So class is definitely an issue here, which you have to think through as we talk about the role of the escaped slave in relation to the other slaves in the Black community. This will come up in Kindred as well, which is our last novel, where the character who travels in time there is treated as pseudo-white because she's kind of working with the white master, and she's very humiliated at the idea of being alienated from her Black community. So all that is going over here. What does exceptionalism mean? How is it a problem? How is it addressed? And how is it a rhetorical situation for the escaped slave in the narrative? Continuing on, without saying a word, she quietly awaited her fate. No one bid for her. At last, a feeble voice said, $50. That would have been nothing for a slave at the time. That's basically nothing. It came from a maiden lady, 7 years old, the sister of my grandmother's deceased mistress. She had lived 40 years under the same roof with my grandmother. She knew how faithfully she had served her owners and how cruelly she had been defrauded of her rights, and she resolved to protect her. The auctioneer waited for a higher bid, but her wishes were respected. No one bid above her. She could neither read nor write, and when the bill of sale was made out, she signed with a cross. But what consequence was that when she had a big heart overflowing with human kindness? She gave the old servant her freedom. Couple things. Big debate about this novel is whether there is sisterhood across race or not. Big debate. William says, yes, there's cross-race sisterhood, and the sisterhood is the thing that combats white patriarchy. Carby won't have it. There's no sisterhood. White women are a disgrace in the book. Look at Mrs. Flint. What a basket case she is. She's like almost more demonic than Mr. Flint in some really weird ways. She spits in food so the slaves can't have leftover food. I mean, ick. So that's the question. What is happening here? What you have here is kind of a sisterhood, but there's also a disgraceful way in which the purchase is made. You'll see the same thing happen with Linda later in her relationships with white women. There's an empowerment, a need for them, a need for the jobs, and then there's also some element of disgrace as she's exploited and not completely a human being to them. I don't want to give a spoiler away, but this is a major foreshadowing of the end of Linda's actual narrative, you will see. And Linda doesn't like it. She doesn't want to be treated as a commodity ever. She won't have it. The other thing here is the role of literacy, right? So this woman cannot read or write. Again, it's that class narrative, and it's the sense that class more than race defines character, which is itself problematic, goes through a lot of literature, uses class to kind of trump race, like To Kill a Mockingbird, right? Oh, racism is only in poor whites, not in the gentleman class, which is not true, right? It's rhetoric that is certainly rare today. So what you have here is a kind of cross-class line, but the signing it with a cross is interesting, right? Not signing it with her mark, but signing with a cross. It seems to suggest a sort of religious affirmation or reclamation of her election, right? Of her sort of ability to move on spiritually. We don't know if the white editor put that in to make it look like, oh, white women are saviors. Some of my classes have suspected that, or whether this was really a legitimate moment. There is a way that Linda Brent, or Harriet Jacobs through Linda Brent, deconstructs the role of literacy as being empowering. In fact, letters are a primary way where Dr. Flint persecutes her and says unmentionable things in letters to her. So he uses literacy as a tool of oppression. Like I said in Douglas, literacy is empowerment. Literacy, they're the way you rise up from your bootstraps kind of thing. Here, not so much. And I think it's because she's making a distinction between literacy and religion, which she sees as very oppressive in terms of what the slaves are told by preachers to do and not do. She sees it as an agent of complicity, and that there's a more heartfelt kind of connection that could be made between women, at least, that is pre-literate or has nothing to do with literacy, since literacy is so tied up, in her view, with patriarchy and abuse and the law, which of course doesn't accord citizenship to people like her or to her children, even though their father is white. All right, so I don't want to take up much time. I just wanted to get those issues out there because there's so many, just in terms of the complexities of one passage. So when you find, I call them juicy passages, when you find really juicy ones with all these things going on, sit down and tackle it. And the method is look at how each sentence is evoking patterns throughout the text that you can sort of weigh as evidence, and then think of other places in the text that may or may not speak to this issue. Like, oh, is there cross-race sisterhood or not? Is literacy empowering, or is it actually oppressive? Is Aunt Marthy a really nurturing force in the text? Or does she have her moments where she's pretty complicit with the system? What about class? Is it okay to have a discourse of class that creates exceptionalism? These are all questions that you can kind of consider as you go forth. All right, let me stop sharing my screen. Stop sharing. Okay, then I can go back here. All right, I'm not great at the technology yet, but I also want to know from you, I am happy to do these mini lectures between texts as we connect texts, or if you want my perspective, like I had to kind of limit what I could do with discussion questions to either I gave you a couple issues or just one, because I didn't want it to be a chaotic discussion forum. It's easy for that to happen, but I am happy to do these mini lectures for you at any time. Gives me a purpose, a reason to shower. Honestly, I procrastinated a little bit because I haven't really kept up my makeup and hair during quarantine, because why bother? So I was like, oh, I have to actually comb my hair and get presentable for you. So thank you for that opportunity. But I need to know from you how useful these mini lectures are and how you feel about them. If you feel they're useful, just speak up, and I'm happy to do them and post them at any time. If you have specific things in a text you want looked at, like when we look at Nella Larson's text, we're going to talk a lot about whether passing in that text is a matter of race or sexuality, because there's a lot of questions about the main character in there actually maybe being lesbian and not able to deal with that, more than the fact that her friend is passing for white and that makes her upset. So there's like all these kind of debates, and I'm happy to contextualize them for you. But I'm also happy if it's not useful and you just want to engage on in the text on your own, I'm fine with that as well. One bad habit I have is giving away parts of the text that you haven't read yet. I've been faulted for that, so I try really hard not to do that, but it's hard not to do that when I know the literature well. So anyway, again, welcome, and I'll try not to make these too long, and I look forward to your posts on that passage because it is an amazingly rich passage. And then in the forum, you can also comment on other moments that you felt were very poignant or interesting. As you can imagine, I am absolutely happy to have you comment on contemporary events as you look at these historical events. I welcome, some projects on contemporary events if that's what you like to do. So thanks everyone, and you probably will see my dog Haven throughout if I do mini lectures because he's always by my side. Bye everyone.